Well, thank you very much, Georgina, and to Zach, and to all of the team at RMI behind another fine conference. With this year's theme on coming to power, learning to govern, and gathering momentum, this paper will turn to Robert Menzies' second period as Prime Minister and discuss the keynote achievements of one of his most senior cabinet ministers, Sir Percy Spender, 1897 to 1985. So after Robert Menzies returned to the Prime Ministership in December 1949, Percy Spender served as his first Minister for External Affairs from 19th of December 1949 until the 26th of April 1951, when he was succeeded by Richard Casey. Although Spender's 17-month tenure in the portfolio was relatively brief, he was arguably one of our most consequential ministers for foreign affairs since the Second World War. The signature achievements included the negotiation of the Colombo Plan, the signing of the ANZUS Treaty, and the negotiation of the Japanese Peace Treaty. According to Professor David Lowe, the widely travelled Spender had a highly developed sense of geopolitics and of change in the Asia-Pacific region. Percy Claude Spender was born in the inner Sydney suburb of Darlinghurst on the 5th of October 1897. Educated at Fort Street High School, he eventually matriculated to the University of Sydney, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws with first-class honours and the University Medal. In 1923, he was admitted to the New South Wales Bar and set up chambers in Phillip Street, where he specialised in commercial law and even co-authored a textbook called Company Law and Practice. In 1935, he took silk, and at 38, he became the youngest King's Counsel in the British Empire at the time. Following his successful career at the New South Wales Bar, Spender set his sights on federal politics. And in a bit of retrospective deja vu, he contested the Sydney seat of Warringah as an independent in 1937 and won it handsomely against the sitting UAP member Archdale Parkhill on ALP preferences. In a family twist of irony, his son John Spender, who held the seat of North Sydney as a Liberal MP, would be defeated by an independent MP, Ted Mack, in 1990, while his granddaughter Allegra Spender would come full circle as an independent MP to once again defeat the sitting centre-right MP in the eastern seat of Wentworth in last year's election. So while Percy Spender was elected to federal parliament as an independent, he soon came across to the UAP, United Australia Party, in 1938, then led by Prime Minister Joe Lyons. With Robert Menzies assuming the Prime Ministership for the first time in 1939, Spender's potential was recognised when he was appointing acting treasurer in November 1939, and then treasurer from March to October 1940. In the Treasury portfolio, he favoured a Keynesian interventionist approach to managing the economy, which he believed was justified in wartime circumstances. After serving as treasurer, Spender served as Minister for the Army from 1940 to 41 until the Curtin Labor government came to power. In opposition, Spender published a book on Australian foreign policy in 1944, and in 1945 he followed Menzies into the new Liberal Party of Australia. Despite supporting interventionist measures in wartime, Spender's philosophical instincts were essentially liberal. In his speeches, he stressed the primacy of the human spirit and focused on the individual and freedom of choice, while expressing an antipathy towards socialism and centralised bureaucratic planning. In particular, he deplored communism as a threat to the survival of freedom, democracy, and Christian civilization in the West. With the return of Menzies to the Prime Ministership in December 1949, Menzies appointed Spender as his Minister for External Affairs. Now, to better appreciate the innovative contributions Spender made to Australian foreign policy in the early post-war years, it would just be helpful to traverse some of the background experiences and influences that informed his outlook on foreign affairs. Unique for a conservative politician of his era, Spender's primary international exposure had been in the region of Asia at a time when his contemporaries typically made their first overseas trips to Britain. It was his first-hand experience of Asia that equipped Spender with an insight into the region and the need for a post-war Australia to forge closer ties in the Asia-Pacific region. During his career at the bar in the 1920s and 30s, Spender had essentially discovered Asia as a tourist, where he went on board an ocean liner for cruises to Hong Kong, the Philippines, Hawaii, Singapore, and many parts of Malaysia and Indonesia. As Lowe noted, Spender's cruises as a tourist brought an awareness of geography and at least some sensitivity to the social and economic conditions in the region. And this first-hand knowledge enabled Spender to tailor the 1950 Colombo plan in a way which addressed specific areas of need. The other factor that shaped Spender's outlook was, of course, the advice he received from the Department of External Affairs. When the Menzies government assumed office from 1949, the department was led by the Secretary, Dr. John Burton, who had reviewed Australia's relations with Asia. One of the key strands of Burton's thinking was the growing interdependence of Australia and Southeast Asia. Conscious of both the spectre of communism and also the shift to decolonisation in the region after the war, Burton envisioned an Australia that could play an effective role in establishing stable, moderate, and friendly governments in Southeast Asia, which would serve as a security buffer between Australia and mainland Asia. Burton held that the best way for Australia to exert political influence was by fostering economic development in the region through expanded trade and the provision of economic and technical assistance. Through his review of departmental briefs, it was evident that Minister Spender adopted Burton's pattern of thinking and brought this to the 1950 Colombo Conference that birthed the Colombo Plan. Attended by the foreign ministers of 8 Commonwealth countries, including Spender, the Colombo Conference of January 1950 aimed to address the economic and security needs of South and Southeast Asia in the face of burgeoning communism in the region. The participating nations included Australia, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, India, Ceylon, later Sri Lanka, and also Pakistan. Contributing to the conception of the Colombo Plan at the conference and leading the drafting process, Spender proposed that the distribution of food and raw materials be part of the Commonwealth's regional aid program for South and Southeast Asia. In addition, Spender called upon the governments represented at Colombo to make credit available for essential productive purposes in the region, and the beneficiaries of this aid would be Pakistan, India, and Ceylon, with others beneficiaries to follow. While the conference conceived the Colombo Plan, the initiative itself would assume greater form with the inclusion of more countries and the adoption of new programs, not least the student exchanges which allowed promising students from South and Southeast Asian countries to study at Australian universities. Although Spender's contribution to the conception of the early formulation of the Colombo Plan at the 1950 conference is critical, it's important to acknowledge that he was by no means the sole architect. The contributions of the British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevan were significant, as were the inputs of J.R. Jayewardene, the Ceylonese Minister for Finance, and also Ghulam Muhammad of Pakistan. That said, Spender's role was prominent in being assigned the chief drafter of specific measures of the conference to consider and eventually implement. The other dimension that Spender brought to the conception of the Colombo Plan was the engagement of the United States as a potential partner, given its geographical position in the Pacific and also its close relation with Britain and the Commonwealth through shared history, values, and wartime experiences. The United States was initially slow to respond to Spender's overtures, but by November 1950, the Americans decided to associate their own aid proposals with the Colombo Plan Committee. The resolve of Spender to engage the United States brings us to his second signature achievement as External Affairs Minister, where he negotiated the terms of the 1951 ANZUS Treaty. With Spender long recognising the receding influence of Britain in the Pacific, he maintained that some kind of security pact with America would be not only desirable but essential for both Australia's protection and the containment of communism in the Pacific. Addressing the nation in August 1950, Spender proclaimed that Australia must seek to revive the close working association with our American friends, which existed during the war, when John Curtin worked closely with General Douglas MacArthur. Spender said this relationship should, in due course, be given formal expression within the framework of the Pacific Pact. Now, given the natural affinity and warmth between Australia and the United States, it would be easy to assume that Spender's brokering of the ANZUS Treaty would have been a foregone conclusion. But this was far from the case. Spender first raised his proposal for a US-Australasian Pact with President Harry Truman in September 1950. Now, Truman was sympathetic to the idea in principle and agreed to discuss it with his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. But the Secretary doubted the necessity of such a pact, given his view that Australia was not at risk of a hostile attack. The United States envoy John Foster Dulles was even less receptive and suggested that Australia's security needs could be met simply by America retaining its troops in Japan. With wartime hostilities still fresh in the public consciousness, this resolution was clearly unacceptable to Spender, and eventually a compromise between himself, Dulles, and Dean Rusk, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, amounted to an in-principle acceptance of the Australian proposal for a Pacific Pact. The other factor that brought the Americans around to accepting Spender's proposal was the entry of Maoist China into the Korean War in October 1950, to which the United States responded by sending ground troops. And this impressed upon the Americans the importance of the Security Pact. So in 1951, on the 15th of February, Dulles arrived in Canberra to discuss the pact proposal with Australians and New Zealanders. And after further negotiations, a draft security treaty was finally agreed, which largely resembled the form of the final ANZUS Pact. and Ralph Harry of the External Affairs Department played a key role in Spender's negotiating team of drafting ANZUS's terms. The United States Senate approving the draft, the ANZUS Treaty was signed in San Francisco on the 1st of September 1951 by Percy Spender and his New Zealand counterpart, Carl Berenson. Considering the tortuous path of its negotiation, the objections of Great Britain, and even the initial coolness of Menzies himself, the brokering of the ANZUS Treaty was a credit to the tenacity and skilled diplomacy of Spender. According to Andrew Kelly, the ANZUS Treaty was one of the most impressive achievements by an Australian foreign minister. Closely related to Spender's brokering of the ANZUS Treaty was his negotiation of the US-initiated Japanese Peace Treaty of 1951. Desiring to bring a post-war Japan into the Western alliance against communism, President Truman sought to mend wartime hostilities and negotiate a peace settlement with the Japanese. US envoy Dulles raised America's Japanese peace proposal with Spender in the same Canberra meeting that produced the ANZUS Pact. Reflecting both the spectre of communism and also Australian sentiment at the time, Spender had reservations about the peace proposal, particularly its lack of guarantees against Japanese rearmament. Given, however, that the negotiations of the ANZUS Pact and the Japanese Peace Treaty were interlinked in this one meeting, Spender was pragmatic enough to accept that the disadvantages of the peace treaty could be outweighed by the advantages of procuring the security pact with the United States. Accordingly, he assured Dulles that Australia would give its assent to the Japanese peace treaty, and Spender represented Australia at its signing in San Francisco on the 8th of September 1951. Unlike the ANZUS Treaty, Australia's decision to support the Japanese peace treaty was contentious and went against domestic public opinion. Spender was not insensitive to Australia's national interest, and in negotiations with Dulles, he suggested that Japan be subject to rearmament controls that could help give Australians peace of mind. The US declined to adopt Australia's suggestions, yet Spender was a realist who accepted the peace treaty as a necessary step to buttressing the peace and security of the post-war world. Spender's contribution to the Colombo Plan, the ANZUS Treaty and the Japanese Peace Treaty reflected the broader view of the Menzies government that Australia's post-war focus needed to be in the Asian Pacific. To this end, Spender's priority was on forging closer ties with both the United States and Australia's neighbours in Southeast Asia, but in a way that could not detract from Australia's historical ties with Britain and the Commonwealth. Foreshadowing the thinking behind AUKUS several decades later, Spender favoured a working alliance between the United States and the British Commonwealth, which Australia would be an integral partner with close ties to each. Pivoting Australia's foreign policy towards the Asia-Pacific region so strategically in the aftermath of the Second World War, Spender was well ahead of domestic popular sentiment when Eurocentrism and antipathy towards Asia still lingered. Yet in his overtures to the United States and British Commonwealth, he built on a tradition of Australian foreign policy dating back to Alfred Deakin and the first decade of Federation. Thus, while Spender was an innovator and reformer, his approach to foreign policy was in the conservative realist tradition of the Australian centre-right, in contrast to the more multilateralist approach of his Labour predecessor, H.V. Evatt. Spender was somewhat circumspect towards the new United Nations and favoured the development of bilateral relationships, believing that such partnerships with the United States and British Commonwealth would better serve Australia's national interests and objectives in foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm just wondering, in 1949, it's well known that a large number of the new Liberal MPs were ex-servicemen, and I'm just wondering, was there any vocal concern or opposition to Percy Spender's movements towards Japan from that grouping, or from maybe outside groups like the RSL? Was there any sort of criticism of his peacemaking attitude towards Japan?
Well, that's a very fine question, Lucas. It's true that a lot of Australian ex-servicemen served in Australia's Parliament, a few of who had been prisoners of war under the Japanese, and these included Tom Uren from the Labor Party, Sir John Carrick, who served as Education Minister, and Sir Alec Downer, Senior, who served as Immigration Minister in Menzies' cabinet. They were all POWs in Japanese camps, but I think all of them had sort of a big-hearted, magnanimous attitude towards Japan in the post-war years, and a lot of them accepted that Japan after the Second World War had changed for the better. Japan had turned over a new leaf from its military past and became a very peace-loving country and a good international citizen, determined to be a positive contributor to the world. And I think that was recognised in Australia. And Australia's relationship with Japan evolved with the signing of the Thomas Agreement in 1958, and later on, in the Fraser years, there was a treaty of friendship that was signed between Australia and Japan in the late 1970s. And Japan, of course, became our largest trading partner until it was eclipsed by China in more recent times.
David, well done. Very enjoyable. I know that Spender left Parliament in 51, so he was relatively young. He was only, 53, 54. And Menzies was in power for much longer. The coalition was in power for the next 20 years. He went off to become the ambassador to the US. But did he ever regret leaving Parliament so relatively early? And next question, he died in the mid-80s. So do we have any record of Everett's views on, say, the Whitlam government's relationship with the United States?
Yeah, no, they're great questions, Tom. Yes, I read that Spender had a career as Australian ambassador to the United States, and he saw that in a way as an extension of the work he had done in negotiating ANZUS, but in a different capacity, of course. He doesn't seem to have made many pronouncements on Australian politics. In latter years, I didn't come across anything. Yes, they would be well worth reading, and I'm sure they would provide a lot of valuable insights into his thinking on Australian politics, and perhaps on the return of Labor to office under Whitlam in the 1970s as well. No, I'm not aware of it personally, but I would, it's something I could do further research into.
Thank you. I just wondered if you'd like to expand a little bit on the relationship between Menzies and Spender, and particularly the claim that's often made that Menzies saw Spender as a threat and deliberately manoeuvred him out of the job and to Washington to get rid of him.
Yes, thank you, Charlie. I mean, it is interesting, of course, you know, even within the same party, in the same government, there will always be different shades of opinion and different perspectives. And I think Spender's foreign policy outlook was a little bit different from that of Menzies in the early years. I think Spender had that predisposition towards Asia, which was not shared by Menzies at the time. And so that was one area of difference. And when it came to the negotiation of the ANZUS treaty, Menzies was a bit cool about the idea because he was obviously more vested in the British Commonwealth and in maintaining Australia's links with Britain and the Commonwealth, and not so keen on the idea of entering into a Pacific Pact. But of course, the idea grew on Menzies, and Menzies became an enthusiastic supporter of ANZUS later on. And of course, when Menzies retires in 1966, in his press conference, he cites the ANZUS treaty as one of his proudest achievements. But certainly there were differences in outlook and perspective between the two men. And it's perhaps true that Menzies appointed Spender as ambassador to the United States as a way of I guess, putting his stamp on the composition of the cabinet and the future direction that his government would take. Yes, I think it is. Obviously, his term is renewed. I'm not 100% sure, but I think terms as ambassador are 5 years, or only 3 years actually.
I just wanted to add a little postscript because there's a period of history that was totally forgotten in Australia. That's the government of Joe Lyons, where Robert Menzies was the Attorney General. And back in 1935, when Joe Lyons ended up on the cover of Time magazine and went to the United States, he and President Roosevelt sat up on late at night discussing a Pacific Pact. And Lyons brought the idea back, where it was crushed by those pro-Britishers in the Lyons cabinet, one of whom probably was Robert Menzies. So we did get to that pact idea a long way ahead of Percy Spender, and it's great to see that finally Robert Menzies came round to it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anne, for that insight. I was not aware of that meeting between Lyons and Roosevelt. That's most interesting.